In China, there's a saying, 有关系没关系，没有关系有关系, which means if you have the guanxi, the relationship, everything's going to be okay. And if you don't, nothing will be.
Many of our clients work with China. So I've personally met team managers working with employees from China and HR managers hiring in China. And what's in common to all of them is that they're mystified by how business processes work with China. How could you demystify working with them?
Right. There's a saying in China that in China, nothing is easy, but everything's possible. But it becomes impossible when you come with the wrong tools, right? So when you go to make a hole in a wall with a screwdriver, it's not going to work as well as with a hammer, right? So you always have to use the right tools when you come to communicate with China.
Right. So from your experience, what are the 3 mistakes that Westerns do with China, and what are the 3 tools that could help them avoid them?
The top mistake or the top complaint I get from clients is that the Chinese gave them a yes and it actually meant something completely different. And I always say in China there are 50 shades of yes and 49 of them mean no.
So you have to differentiate between yes, I agree and yes, I'm with you.
Absolutely.
How could you tell between the yeses and nos?
Right. So I advise my clients to always ask open-ended questions like, how do you see this? What's the process going to look like on your end? And see that you actually got an agreement and not just a nod from your Chinese partner. And of course, it has to be backed up by action, like sending an email, making the right introductions, etc.
So all that is to avoid ambiguity.
Absolutely. And that's the second mistake people do, is to assume that it's common sense. But common sense is not so common, definitely not in China. And if you say that you prefer a cheaper option, or even imply that in your communication, they might give you different level of engineers or translators or whatever, because they understood that you're interested in a cheaper option. But they will not communicate it to you because for them it's obvious, because they implied or filled in the gaps with your presumed intention.
So they won't ask you questions about it?
No, they won't ask the question. They will fill in the gaps themselves unless you build the box. And this is a very important tool working with China. You build the box properly, you get the buy-in, of course, from your partners, but you have to be very detailed in how you want things to happen. Otherwise, it's going to happen their way, and it's not necessarily how you want it, because 3 months into the process, you might realize that you're working in completely different directions.
You wouldn't want that. So this explains that whenever you work with a Chinese company, even if you buy from a Chinese company, they really go into detail. So my question is, if you go into detail in a certain contract, will that just solve the whole process?
There is a lot of emphasis in the West on the contract.
Yeah,
right?
you have to go by the contract,
Every
by
detail,
the rules.
right?
Yeah.
So actually in China, it's important to have a contract, obviously, with penalties and everything. But in China, there's a saying, 有关系没关系，没有关系有关系, which means relationship. Guanxi is the relationship. And if you have the guanxi, the relationship, everything's going to be okay. And if you don't, nothing will be. So
which is the third mistake.
Right, that's the third mistake, assuming that you can count on a contract. Now, it doesn't matter how good your contract is if your relationship is not good. For example, we had a client, a tech company, who got a call from a very angry customer in China who told them, basically, I have no trust. So they sent about 20 engineers to China to work on the problem on site. And they worked very hard. The atmosphere was very tense. But about 10 days into the process, another guy from the headquarters came to China. And then the Chinese site manager who knew this guy said, oh, Moshe, now you're here. I know everything will be fine. Right? And Moshe was not related at all to the process, which means once you build a relationship, you can mend everything around it.
It's amazing to hear, because it doesn't matter how hard the team worked, just once there was a good relationship, a good guanxi, they could have mended that process.
Yes, and the other way around. When you have no trust, it doesn't matter how well you're working. Because China is a very low trust environment, this gets an even more strong emphasis, right? The building of the relationship is critical.
Your insights can be a game changer for so many Western companies, because so many Western companies come to China unprepared and suffer the consequences.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying that China is an easy environment, but it's here. It's not going anywhere.
From my experience living in China and working with China for over 2 decades, if you're persistent, the process can pay very generous dividends. If you want to build a relationship, when you take the first step, they will take 2 steps towards you. So you go ahead and take the first step.
Take that first step. Thank you so much, Tal.
Thank you.